Of all the archetypes in HSR, Follow-Up might have some of the most fun characters overall. Feixiao, March 7th Hunt, Cypher, Topaz, and while I don't love him, Dr. Ratio. These characters are fantastic with their fast-paced combat style and flashy animations. I mean, just look at Cypher's ultimate.
The lie that everyone believes in becomes a reality! Gotcha!
Beautiful. While I personally love the characters a lot, it feels safe to say Follow-Up is really not what it used to be. Hunt as a whole is doing okay, with Dahlia buffing Boot Hill and Archer being a very consistent threat still, but Follow-Up specifically, they have had a pretty rough time of it. It's time to talk about how Follow-Up fell off and what comes next for this team type. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe, become a YouTube member today, and let's get into it. Now, Follow-Up actually could be in a worse spot if you've invested properly. E2 Feixiao is a massive damage boost for her, often being able to shred any enemy in the game that you need her to. The AoE shill of the game as of late made her life far worse, but hopefully that'll be coming to an end for the foreseeable future. Follow-Up characters right now just don't have much room to stand on, sadly, and that's genuinely pretty disappointing since they are often really fun and well-liked characters. Just think about the amount of people who love using Feixiao E2 to brute force every fight in the game. Or the people who are still in my comments telling me Dr. Ratio isn't actually that bad. You're wrong, by the way. Follow-Up is a very popular archetype, but it truly feels just horrible right now within the state of the game. It wasn't always like this though, but the archetype has received no support up until the release of Asheville, and spoiler alert, we will be talking about him in a not so great light later. He's overall ended up as a pretty good unit, but just a very strange one when you look at the whole picture. What I want to do now is talk about some of the most popular characters in Hunt historically, go over what's wrong with their movesets, and make our way up to the present, where Follow-Up teams have been off meta for about a year roughly. To start this off, let's talk about one of the first traditional Follow-Up characters to be released, Topaz and Numby. As many of you know, I'm a massive fan of Topaz and her gameplay. However, when you look at the screen, you'll notice the gameplay in question is of her as a hyper carry and not a sub DPS, her intended role. Yeah, I've genuinely had more fun with her as a main DPS than a sub DPS, and that is not good. This is mainly due to the fact that Topaz is the most replaced character in HSR, with multiple great characters being able to fill her slot in any team that she's a part of. This wasn't always the case though, with Topaz from 1.3 to 2.5 being the best sub DPS option for follow-up attacks in HSR. Her kit had a heavy focus on this specific aspect, wanting to juice up the strength of follow-ups as much as humanly possible. This comes from her unique debuff, Proof of Debt. This status is attached to her skill Difficulty Paying. When an enemy is inflicted with Proof of Debt, they will take an additional 50% damage from follow-up attacks. While HSR has definitely had a lot of power creep with numbers just exploding off the charts, an additional 50% anything is nothing to sneeze at even nowadays. This would help improve her own damage with her skill and basic attack both being counted as follow-ups, and the damage output of her main DPS would also improve substantially thanks to this massive multiplier. Topaz was a bit directionless for her early existence in HSR. The first true follow-up DPS to come out was Dr. Ratio, meaning everyone before that was interesting to use Topaz with. One of the only early cases I could find was Jing Yuan, since he relied on Lightning Lord to do his damage, and as a fun fact for all of you, Lightning Lord is actually considered follow-up damage. It's also bounce damage, so that just makes no sense on an Air Edition character. This pairing really still wasn't ideal, however, considering Jing Yuan was already a little mediocre at that point, and really enjoyed having two supports entirely dedicated to him. We can skip the rest of the early retrospective and go straight to the release of Dr. Ratio in version 1.6. Finally, Topaz had her best DPS, and they worked incredibly together. Topaz fulfilled all of Ratio's debuff requirements with her Light Cone, meaning your third slot could be used for anyone you wanted. Pela, Ting Yun, Silverwolf, Ron May, anyone else you had in mind. It was absolutely incredible. Ratio is also an even better DPS for Topaz than you would imagine. Topaz increases follow-up damage specifically, and Ratio's damage primarily comes from his follow-up attack. This massive boost couldn't be found anywhere else, and was a huge benefit to this team, making them arguably the best team in the game during this time period. So now we have to ask, what happened to Topaz? This is a video I want to make fully at a later point, but from here, the decline really starts. Robin came out in 2.2 to give follow-up another massive boost, and Aventurine was in 2.1. This team had all the power in the world until Feixiao arrived in version 2.5. Alongside her came two more characters in the form of March 7th Hunt and Moz. These two are follow-up sub-DPS, and because they were over a version newer, they had quite a bit more to them than Topaz. March 7th Hunt had an enhanced basic attack to output massive damage, while still having incredible attack frequency similar to Topaz. All of this combined made the two comparable, but one was an older 5-star when buffs were an impossible concept, and one was a free 4-star you could max out by playing events. Quite a bit of a difference there. As for Moz, while my knowledge on him is more limited, in terms of sheer attack frequency, he is the best option over everyone else, being a min-maxer's dream character to activate follow-up conditions. While Topaz was still a fine option for those who had her, these two characters existing now made life far harder for her, and ultimately began to push her into complete irrelevance. A sub-DPS not being the best for a character anymore often immediately makes them struggle in the meta, and with Topaz's ability to scale up severely hampered by her moveset, this was how we saw Topaz fall away from the top of the meta. Topaz is simply one example of how power creep functions in this game. Eventually, the next big thing will come along and knock you down the pecking order. That is just simply life in gacha games. Where we encounter a bigger problem, however, is from what happens if power creep keeps occurring, but support doesn't. This is part of the issue we see with the next character I want to talk about, Dr. Ratio. I've talked a lot about Dr. Ratio since he has probably been the greatest dropper in all of Honkai Star Rail. He peaked at T0 and has landed himself all the way into T5, the worst of the worst in this game. You may be asking how this can happen, and while the simple answer is power creep, that's not always the whole story. Ratio is a powerful DPS upon initial release, and despite his requirement to have debuffs on his team in some way, shape, or form, he was still rather flexible, since debuffs could in fact be gotten from multiple light cones and characters. This design was honestly pretty unique, and in my opinion really went hand in hand with the identity Hunt was developing. Topaz was a character who had debuffs to implant on targets naturally, and with her light cone, Ratio could inflict his own debuff on targets, and in the future, Moz followed suit with his own unique debuff. Debuffs have always been a part of the identity of follow-up characters, and Ratio capitalized on this with his kit. Starting with the summation trace, Ratio gains crit rate and crit damage for each debuff on a target, stacking up to 6 times. While nowadays the numbers aren't massive, crit rate increases were uncommon back then, and made building characters drastically easier without many other free ways to raise crit rate efficiently. His next trace, Deduction, is also pretty nice, increasing his own damage up to 50% if you have 5 debuffs on a target. Ratio is the character of the Hunt Path who most ran with the design of needing debuffs on your enemy to maximize performance, and it was in fact a really unique design choice compared to many other characters at the time, and even now. It affected everything, even down to his follow-up attack, which was the bread and butter of his moveset, unlike many other follow-up characters. While Feixiao relies on her powerful ultimate and just all of her damage being counted as follow-up damage, and March relied on her basic attack, Ratio was all about his follow-ups. The damage multiplier on his skill is 270% of his attack, whereas his ultimate is only 240%. His ultimate, funnily enough, also gives him 2 free uses of this follow-up attack, further emphasizing its importance and strength in this kit. The design here was super solid and felt the most like a true follow-up DPS, but the cracks always start to form when enough time has passed. To make follow-up excel, a character with high attack frequency has to exist to allow your DPS to go. Moz and Topaz are very good at this, don't get me wrong, but for as fast as they can go, damage eventually falls off as a game progresses. Ratio was a victim of power creep to Feixiao, and the consistent AoE nature of the game during Amphorius isolated him a great deal. Feixiao benefited from high attack frequency in the same way as him, while also having more normal damage to compensate, and her big hit being even better in the form of a fast-acting ultimate. Ratio saw his best teammates all migrate away from him, and we've yet to see him buffed as part of the new Nova Flare system, despite his very clear inferiority in the metagame. I think a few reasons exist for this, but the main ones I can point to are 1. Too many people would benefit considering Feixiao was a completely free character that much of the player base has. And as for number 2, Feixiao exists as a competent option still. This is what I personally think, but either way, the truth is undeniable that Feixiao is just an obsolete character now that Hoyoverse has yet to revive in any way, shape, or form. I'm sorry, Doctor. You are no longer huge. I should be executed for that last line. I can't believe I wrote that. That brings us to the last major piece of follow-up I want to discuss before we talk about the present situation more. Feixiao. Feixiao is the one true queen of follow-up right now. And that is unfortunately a sad title to have when you're barely a meta character still. Feixiao was the last main DPS to be primarily a follow-up unit, and she was released all the way back in version 2.5. Needless to say, it's been a while. Her overall design, however, is still pretty amazing. She just has been a big victim of poor support and constant power creep. Let's start with her positives. Feixiao possesses one of the most unique ultimates in the game. For every 2 attacks ally targets put out, Feixiao will gain a stack of Flying Aureus. When Feixiao has 6 stacks, she can activate her ultimate, unleashing powerful single target damage. While the actual damage amount isn't as high screenshot-wise as characters like Acheron, Feixiao gets her ultimate a lot more than many other characters. This is where her damage really comes, not her follow-up attacks. The way her follow-up attacks play into this equation, however, is still really important. Feixiao will follow up any attack once per turn. She will also automatically follow up her own skill. This follow-up contributes to her ultimate obviously, but her traces are also heavily linked to this follow-up attack / skill. When using skill, you gain an attack boost of 48%, which is massive for any character. When Feixiao uses this follow-up, she actually gains a 60% damage boost as well. This is genuinely so nice and is a massive boost for her combat ability. Last but not least, all of Fei's follow-up attacks have a 36% crit damage increase. Simple, yet efficient. Oh, there's also one more thing. Fei's ultimate is also considered a follow-up attack, so it gets even more damage. That is terrifying. Feixiao as a follow-up character still embodies the niche very well, with her follow-ups being a main source of her gameplay to both increase her damage and get her ult with blistering speed. She possesses an extremely unique design, and while her multipliers now are limited, she has a style that can still be enhanced. This is because her main important stat is the amount of attacks your team can output. Output a lot, get more ults, do more damage. While not a perfect formula to stay strong forever, there is genuinely still potential to improve her performance even without Eidolons, I think. With that said, let's get the idealism out of the way. Feixiao is also a bit of a low cycle merchant. Feixiao is a character who heavily relies on a sustainless playstyle to accomplish most things in this game. However, her multipliers and HSR's complete unwillingness to provide her with a more competent support has landed her more and more in the irrelevant tier of characters, basically making her only usable by min-maxers and the Eagle cult. And usable is always a stretch when in terms of hunt, Archer is right there, alongside Boot Hill with the Dahlia. Feixiao, despite being one of the coolest characters in the game, has simply struggled to keep up now with a lot of AoE shilling during Amphorius, and now the HP inflation reaching a level beyond what she can keep up with anymore. Now that we've gone over a bit of a history lesson and retrospective regarding follow-up characters, let's talk about their reality in HSR right now. They are not good. Not only was the last follow-up DPS Feixiao, who was released in 2.5, the attempts to support the path at large have been minimal, to say the least. Hunt characters at this point have received one Nova Flare with Seela, who wasn't even a follow-up character, and arguably had even more issues than anyone else I've talked about today. So Topaz as a sub-DPS built for follow-up was never buffed, Feixiao was never buffed, and while Moze and March are good, they can't do everything alone, and need a good DPS to support. These two are also a bit old at this point, if we're being really realistic. What follow-up needed was some really good new support, and this was meant to come in the form of 2 characters, Cypher and Ashveil. Unfortunately, that's not how life worked out. Let's talk about these two, starting with Cypher. Now, I'm not technically supposed to talk about this, but these two characters were the biggest beta victims in HSR history, and I don't think it's close. It hurts to see what could have been, but we move on. Cypher was an Nihility character, released in version 3.3. She has a pretty simplistic kit with a powerful vulnerability debuff that's always active, a follow-up attack that activates every turn, and a skill that can hit 3 targets and increase her attack. As she was coming out, she was signaled as being good for 2 very specific characters, Acheron and Feixiao. Both these characters were struggling 2.x DPS who hadn't seen much assistance for quite some time. For Feixiao, she last received aid in the patch she released, and for Acheron, her last character buff was in Zhao Cho from version 2.4. With that context, Cypher sounds like a breath of fresh air for the two, right? Well, she was. Kinda. Cypher was a character who lacked the rapid attack output someone like Moz had. She was more powerful in the sense she gave a huge debuff and had a powerful ultimate to finish off enemies. But, all in all, it was essentially a side grade. The attack frequency for Feixiao was a big deal breaker, and all that extra damage potential wasn't as immense as you think when considering just how good Moz was at stacking small hits. Cypher was capable of being SP positive, while Moz would always be neutral, which was a nice differentiating factor, but ultimately not as essential as you would think for a good Feixiao team. All of Fei's best supports aren't huge on SP, characters like Robin, Avin, and then soon-to-be DHPT at the time. For some certain other comps, this could end up being a massive help, but not for a great deal of players. Cypher didn't really bring enough else to the table either when looking at specifically Feixiao. Acheron benefited a fair bit from this feline phenom, but sadly, this left our second favorite Fox high and dry with still a minimal amount of help. After version 3.3, everything went quiet in the HSR development cycle for follow-up. Archer was out and dominating, DOT was being revived, and Mono-Rem continued its push to be the most shilled comp in the game. Meanwhile, follow-up as an archetype was essentially dying out. Archer had follow-ups, yes, but we all know he's a skill damage DPS. No other character after him had follow-ups as a big part of their kit either. That was until we arrive at the present day, with none other than the detective himself, Ashveil. Now I love Ashveil a lot. He is a goofy character who doubles as arguably one of the most terrifying characters in combat, animation, and story-wise. What I don't note here is the gameplay, and unfortunately, this is where Ashveil falls short. Falling short is pretty relative here, so let me explain a bit before anyone starts grabbing their pitchforks. Ashveil survived a turbulent beta cycle, and came out the other side as a competent DPS character. As of this recording, he sits right around here on Predwin, which, while not the best metric, often does work well enough when taking into account the vast majority of players. The problem with Ashveil is really the same problem as Cypher, unfortunately. He has a kit indicative of being a great sub-DPS character. It combines elements of Cypher and Tribby while still being a solid damage dealer all on his own. He relies on follow-ups to do the majority of his work too, which sounds like what we're looking for. Ashveil simply just doesn't fit with the current concept of follow-up characters. He relies primarily on a hypercarry playstyle, with anyone besides Tribby being an active detriment to his success. Despite his built-in buffs that seem like another character is meant to benefit off of them, a character like Feixiao genuinely only slows him down, as wild as that is to say. On his own, he still exists as a strong character, but in the current landscape of the game, he's still not quite as good as the other top tiers in my opinion. Now I know, again, he sits up very high on the tier list. From what I've seen, it's not quite as forgiving as you would think. All of this, and simultaneously, he doesn't truly benefit any of the existing follow-up characters either. Follow-up was an archetype that always focused on dual DPS lineups, providing consistent and fast attacks to wear down an enemy. The hunt path overall has begun to stray more towards its roots again. Strong, single target damage amplified to the maximum. While this is fun and Ashveil is good and fun, this just isn't what many players wanted to see, and that is a damn shame. This takes me to the final topic of the day. Follow-up has been an archetype that's been a fan favorite for a long time, but also one that's been getting weaker over time without any real reprieve. So what can we do about follow-up? I will never claim to be an expert in game design, as if you've ever watched my videos talking about buffs, I don't got much up here if it isn't related to Fire Emblem or the NBA. Weird combo, I know, moving on. First things first, these characters need very strong multipliers. Even if something seems unrealistic, it may just be safe to stay. We have Archer, who can do 1000% ultimates, and like 20% of a boss's health bar with the final shot on his skill alone. That sounds ridiculous, but at this point, that's kinda mid if Sparkle hadn't gotten buffed to keep him relevant for longer. High scaling multipliers is perfectly fine for these characters. Obviously, you don't want power creep to set in too fast, but the mentality with HSR always feels like if everyone is super, no one is. Making characters ridiculous to keep up with the unreal power of others is something that is expected and needs to happen. Second, there was something specific about Asheville that always confused me. Feixiao could trigger her follow-up upon using her skill. Ratio's follow-up was entirely limited to his skill, unless he activated his ultimate. Asheville is simply not capable of activating his own follow-up for more damage unless it's his ultimate. His ultimate's follow-up is different as well, being an enhanced follow-up that goes off all at once, really just being a natural part of his ultimate damage. Follow-up characters should be able to trigger their own follow-up on top of allies triggering it as well. It's simple, yes, but this is additional damage, charges, hits, whatever might matter most for that specific character. It makes sense to have it, and I do hope it stays as a more consistent feature for the main DPS characters. Sub DPS not having it can make sense since they're not meant to be the ones doing the primary damage. They're on the team to help contribute chip damage and hits in general. Follow-up characters, and really Hunt as a whole, struggle a great deal sometimes with the make of this game. Being a character who can attack a single target in a game constantly throwing waves of enemies at you is brutal. Especially when at times, the bosses just won't favor you. At all. These characters being high-powered is a positive, and something I do think is needed to some degree. I know some will disagree with me, but that's what I've seen over time from the general player base, and I always try to express the feelings and opinions that they do with these videos, so that all of these players can feel seen and understood. The Hunt path is a confusing one, and follow-up as an archetype even more so. I can safely say, however, Asheville was a step in the right direction, and I hope follow-up comes back even harder sometime soon. HSR will be a more fun game with these guys back near the top. Thank you so much for watching, I really do appreciate it. The last video I did of this type was a long time ago, focusing on the Nihility path. I like examining paths or archetypes at large, and I'll probably keep doing so over time. If you have a specific path you'd like to see next, leave it in the comments below, and who knows, maybe I'll do that one next. I've got plenty more good videos coming out soon, so I'll see you guys then. Bye bye!